How medieval engineers made heating last 5 days with one tiny fire, tested in 1822. What if one fire could heat your home for 3 days? April 1822, Poland. Engineers test a 400-year-old furnace nobody has used in decades. Malbork Castle's banqueting hall, 850 square meters at 6 degrees Celsius. 0.7 cubic meters of wood, 3.5 hours of fire. Then nothing. Air at 200 degrees rushes from stones below. The hall warms to 22.5 degrees in 20 minutes. Next morning, still 14 degrees. Day 3, 19 degrees. One fire, 3 days of heat. Medieval engineers built hundreds of these across Estonia, regular townhouses, not palaces. In 2025, your heating dies the second you stop paying. What did we forget? The heat storage revolution. Let me tell you about the greatest heating upgrade in medieval history, and it starts with Roman failure. The Romans invented the hypocausts, hot air flowing under floors, warming rooms from below, brilliant for bathhouses, terrible for efficiency. Roman hypocausts had to burn constantly, all day, all night. The moment you stopped feeding the fire, the heat disappeared. The system had almost zero thermal storage. It was like modern central heating, effective while running, useless when off. When the Roman Empire collapsed, most of Western Europe lost this technology completely. Britain went from heated villas to freezing castles. For nearly 1,000 years from around 400 AD until 1900, central heating simply did not exist in Britain. But something different happened in Northern Europe. Christian monasteries spread across the Baltic region, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, northern Germany, Poland. These monks inherited Roman hypocaust technology, but they faced winters the Romans never dealt with. Baltic winters meant death. So sometime in the 14th century, possibly earlier, medieval engineers did something revolutionary. They looked at the Roman hypocaust and asked, what if we do not just move hot air? What if we store the heat? They added granite stones. Here is how they built it. Below the room you wanted to heat, you dug an underground furnace chamber. You covered this chamber with a barrel vault made of brick. The vault had 3 or 4 arches, with gaps of about 20 centimeters between them. Medieval builders probably used an old wooden vat to help shape these arches. On top of this vault, you piled granite stones, each stone 40 to 50 centimeters in diameter, roughly the size of a basketball. You filled the chamber until you had several tons of granite sitting above your furnace. Above the stones, you built a floor with special vents, round holes, 10 to 12 centimeters in diameter. These vents had covers, metal, stone, or fired clay plugs that could be opened and closed. The operation was genius. Step 1. Close all the floor vents. Light a fire in the furnace below. Smoke escapes through a chimney. The room above stays smoke-free. Step 2. Let the fire burn for 3 to 4 hours. The flames heat the brick vault. The vault heats the granite stones. The stones absorb massive amounts of thermal energy. Step 3. Once the fire burns out completely, close the chimney damper. This traps all the heat inside the stone chamber. Step 4. Open the floor vents. Hot air, heated by the granite stones, rises into the room above. When the room is warm enough, close the vents again. Step 5. Repeat step 4 whenever you need more heat for the next several days. And here is a detail archaeologists discovered that shows how sophisticated this was. Small ceramic dishes were found placed on the hot stones directly under the venting holes. What were they for? Water. Water. The ceramic dishes held water that evaporated slowly from the heat of the stones. This added humidity to the air rising through the vents. Medieval builders understood that dry heat is uncomfortable. They engineered a humidity control system 800 years ago. Why did it work so well? Granite has a specific heat capacity of 790 joules per kilogram per degree Celsius. In simple terms, granite is incredibly good at storing heat energy. When you heat several tons of granite to high temperature, you create a massive thermal battery. The stones release this energy slowly, over days, warming the air through convection. Roman hypocausts tried to heat air directly. Medieval hypocausts heated mass, and mass remembers. By the end of the 15th century, researchers estimate there were 800 to 1,000 heat storage hypocausts across the Baltic region. In Tallinn alone, 54 systems have been discovered. In Estonia overall, 95 documented systems. This was not cutting-edge technology reserved for the rich. This was standard construction. If you built a stone house in 14th century Estonia, you built a heat storage hypocaust. Let me put the efficiency in perspective. That Malbork experiment used 0.7 cubic meters of spruce. Modern estimates put that at roughly 50 kilograms of wood. At 2025 prices, that is about $15 worth of firewood. $15 for 3 days of heating an 850 square meter hall. The average American home is 200 square meters, 4 times smaller. Yet heating bills run $200 to $400 per month in winter. Medieval engineers got 3 days from $15 of fuel. We get 1 month from $300 of gas. They were 20 times more efficient. And here is what modern engineers miss. This was not just about saving wood. It was about surviving Baltic winters, when wood was scarce. The flat plains of Estonia did not have endless forests. Wood was precious. The heat storage hypocaust was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Medieval engineers faced a constraint and engineered around it so brilliantly that their solution outperformed what we use today. Because let me ask you something. When your power goes out in winter, how long does your home stay warm? In medieval Tallinn, the answer was days. In your modern house, the answer is hours. We call this progress. By the 1500s, glazed tile stoves began replacing heat storage hypocausts. Not because hypocausts stopped working. They worked perfectly. But tile stoves were cheaper to build, faster to install, and nobles wanted individual room control instead of centralized heating. We made the same choice. Individual control over collective efficiency, comfort over resilience, and we are still making that choice today. The monastic efficiency principle. Now let me tell you about the monks who chose to freeze. Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire, England, founded in 1132 by Cistercian monks from Burgundy. At its peak, 140 monks and more than 500 lay brothers lived here, 640 men total. One heated room. This room was called the calefactory, the warming house. It contained a very large double fireplace that was kept burning from November 1st, All Saints' Day, until Good Friday, 5 to 6 months of continuous fire. Every other room in the monastery was unheated. The church, the dormitories, the chapter house, the cloister where monks spent hours copying manuscripts, all freezing cold. Only 3 spaces had fires: the kitchen, the infirmary for the sick, and the kale factory for everyone else. This seems insane. Why would 640 men share one heated room when they had the resources to heat more? Because they understood something we have forgotten. Heating many spaces poorly is worse than heating one space well. Here is the math. If you put a fireplace in every room of a 20-room monastery, you need 20 fires burning constantly, 20 chimneys to maintain, 20 fires to tend, 20 sources of drafts and heat loss. Or you build one massive efficient heating system in one central room. You cluster everyone there during the coldest hours. The fire is enormous, yes, but it is one fire. The room is properly warm, and the collective body heat of hundreds of monks makes the space even warmer. The Cistercians were not being cruel. They were being efficient. Historical records from Fountains Abbey, another Cistercian monastery, show wood consumption for the entire monastery was less than what a single modern American home uses for heating. The monastery housed 250 people. Your house heats 5 people, maybe 6. They survived Yorkshire winters with one fire. You complain when the thermostat drops 1 degree. The monks did not just accept this. They built their daily schedule around thermal efficiency. In winter, they spent more time in the warming house. They dried clothes there. They did some manual work there. They gathered for conversation. Historical records note that monks would gossip illicitly in the warming house because it was one of the few places they could relax together. The warming house became the social and thermal center of monastic life. Now contrast this with modern heating. You heat your bedroom to 22 degrees, even though you are buried under blankets. You heat your living room even when nobody is home. You heat your hallways, your bathrooms, your garage. Every room gets the same temperature, regardless of whether anyone is using it. The average American home heats about 200 square meters. Most families spend their time in maybe 40 square meters. The kitchen, the living room, 1 or 2 bedrooms. Yet we heat the entire house to the same temperature all the time. Medieval monks had the opposite philosophy. Heat the space you are actually using. Accept that unused spaces will be cold. Move to the warm space when you need warmth. We would call this uncomfortable. They called it efficient. At Rievaulx, the warming house was strategically placed between the day room and refectory. The heat radiated into adjacent spaces. The floor above the warming house was used as the muniment room, where important documents were stored. Why? Because dry, warm air prevented parchment from rotting. Everything was integrated. Nothing was wasted. Here is another detail. At Rievaulx, the original timber roof of the warming house was replaced with a stone vault. Why? Because the massive fire in the double fireplace was a potential fire hazard. They reinforced the pillars supporting the roof with an outer layer of stone to handle the extra weight. They were engineering for centuries of continuous use. And it worked. The warming house at Rievaulx still stands today, over 800 years later. The double fireplace is still there. The reinforced pillars are still there. If 640 medieval monks could survive harsh winters by heating one room efficiently, why do we insist on heating 20 rooms poorly? The answer is not that we are smarter. The answer is that energy was cheap enough that we did not have to be smart. But energy is getting expensive again. Thermal mass and stone memory. Let me tell you about Rochester Castle in Kent, England. Built in the 12th century, 113 feet tall. One of the most impressive Norman keeps still standing. And it had the same problem every medieval castle had. Stone sucks heat out of your body like a vampire. If you sit next to a cold stone wall in winter, you feel cold even if the room is warm. That is because your body is radiating heat into the stone. The stone is colder than you, so heat flows from your warm body into the cold wall. Rochester Castle solved this with a two-part strategy. First, heat the stone walls with large fireplaces built directly into the walls. Second, cover the walls with tapestries to prevent heat loss. The goal was not to heat the air. The goal was to heat the mass. At Rochester, you can still see ornate fireplaces with carved stonework and chevron patterns. These were not just functional, they were statements of power, but they worked. Historical records mention that even with all this effort, castle temperatures rarely rose above 15 to 16 degrees Celsius, about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. By modern standards, that is cold. But here is the crucial detail. It was stable. A modern home might heat to 22 degrees, but the moment your heating turns off, that temperature drops fast. Your walls have no thermal mass. Your insulation keeps heat in, but does not store heat. Medieval castles at 15 degrees would stay at 15 degrees for hours after fires went out. Those massive stone walls, once heated, released warmth slowly. This is the difference between heating air and heating mass. Air is easy to heat and easy to cool. Air has almost no thermal capacity. But heat several tons of stone to even moderate temperature, and that stone radiates warmth for 8, 10, 12 hours. Medieval builders understood this instinctively. They built with mass, thick walls, stone floors, heavy materials everywhere, and they heated those materials, not the air around them. Modern builders do the opposite. Thin walls, lightweight materials, maximum insulation to trap heated air, but zero thermal mass to store heat. Which is why, when a winter storm knocks out power, modern homes become uninhabitable in hours. Medieval castles, even unheated, could remain above freezing for days because the massive structure itself held residual heat. Here is another detail. At Rochester Castle, the Great Hall had several grand fireplaces. Historical inventories from 1266 list supplies for feasts: 251 herrings, 50 sheep, 51 salted pigs, quantities of rice, figs and raisins. These grand feasts required massive fires for cooking. Those fires heated the stone walls and floors. The feast generated body heat from hundreds of guests. The combination of fire, food, people, and thermal mass meant the Great Hall stayed comfortable for hours after the feast ended. They did not heat the castle, they heated the stones. And the stones remembered. We abandoned this approach because we found cheaper ways to heat air: natural gas, electric heating, central forced air systems. But those systems have a weakness. They require constant energy input. The moment you stop burning gas or running electricity, the warmth disappears. Medieval thermal mass heating required massive initial effort to heat all that stone. But once heated, it coasted. The stones released warmth passively, without any additional fuel. In an age of expensive energy, maybe thermal mass deserves another look. The textile defense system. Now we need to talk about what looks like decoration, but was actually engineering. Medieval tapestries, those enormous wall hangings you see in castle documentaries, knights fighting dragons, ladies with unicorns, biblical scenes woven in impossible detail. These were not art. They were art, but that was not their primary function. Their primary function was insulation. An estimated 15,000 people were employed in medieval tapestry weaving across Europe. A skilled weaver could complete about 1 square metre per month. 1 square metre, 1 month. Large tapestries took years to produce. Why would anyone invest that much time and money in wall decoration? Because tapestries made of wool provided excellent thermal insulation. Here is the physics medieval weavers discovered empirically. Wool traps air between its fibres. Still air is one of the best insulators known. The R value, the modern measurement for insulation, for a thick wool tapestry is about R3 per inch. Your modern fiberglass insulation, R3.1 per inch. Medieval weavers, using only sheep wool and wooden looms, created insulation nearly as effective as modern materials. Without petroleum, without factories. Just wool and 8 months of labour per tapestry. When you hang a thick wool tapestry on a stone wall, you create an air gap between the tapestry and wall. This air gap acts as additional insulation. The tapestry blocks radiant heat loss. The air gap prevents convective heat loss. Together, they reduce heat loss through that wall by 40% or more. Medieval builders discovered this through experience. They noticed rooms with tapestries were noticeably warmer, so tapestries became standard in any room where people spent time. And the system was multi-layered. First, the stone wall itself, 60 centimetres thick or more. Second, wool stuffed into cracks to prevent drafts. Third, the tapestry on the wall, creating that air gap. Fourth, heavy curtains over windows and doorways. This was not one solution. This was an integrated system of passive insulation. Here is a detail that shows how seriously they took this. Some medieval homes had painted cloths on walls, cheaper than woven tapestries. Just linen or canvas stretched on wooden battens, then painted with decorative scenes. For centuries, historians assumed these were cheap decoration for people who could not afford real tapestries. But research revealed painted cloths were not just for the poor. Even wealthy homes had them. Why? Because the primary purpose was not decoration. It was thermal comfort. The stretched cloth on battens created an air gap. That air gap provided insulation. Whether the cloth was expensive woven tapestry or cheap painted canvas did not matter. Both worked. And here is where it gets clever. A research trip to Normandy found 15th century wall paintings representing tapestries, but actual hooks were above the paintings for hanging real tapestries. The paint ran over the hooks, proving they were installed at the same time. Why paint a tapestry on a wall, then hang a real tapestry over it? Because even a painted cloth on battens, creating that air gap, provided 40% of the insulation value of a real tapestry. It was insurance. When nobles travelled between castles, they took the real tapestries, but they left the painted versions on the walls. The room stayed warmer than bare stone. It was not about art. It was about not freezing when your expensive tapestries were in the other castle. Tapestries were portable. Unlike frescoes, which were permanent, tapestries could be rolled up and transported. This portability meant tapestries could be taken down in summer, then rehung in winter. It also meant tapestries survived wars. When armies attacked, tapestries could be packed and carried to safety. This is why many medieval tapestries still exist today. They were valuable enough to preserve, portable enough to protect, and durable enough to survive. As insulation technology improved in the 18th and 19th centuries, tapestries lost their primary function. They became purely decorative, and many were destroyed, cut up to fit new rooms, sliced apart to fit inside gilt panelling. At Château de Chambord in France, you can still see tapestries wrapped around corners, bent at awkward angles, because installers did not want to cut them. They knew tapestries were valuable. They just did not know why. Because by the 18th century, nobody remembered that tapestries were insulation. They thought they were old-fashioned decoration. We did the same with dozens of medieval technologies. We forgot the why and kept the what. And here is the modern irony. Today, if you want to reduce heating bills in an old house, what do contractors suggest? Heavy curtains, insulating blankets for walls, weather stripping. We are reinventing medieval textile insulation and calling it innovation. The integrated system. Here is what we need to understand. Medieval heating was not one technology, it was a system. Heat storage hypocausts used thermal mass to create multi-day thermal batteries. Monastic calefactories used centralized heating to maximize efficiency. Castle fireplaces heated stone walls that radiated warmth for hours. Textile insulation prevented heat loss through massive stone walls. But these were not separate solutions. They worked together. Imagine a wealthy home in 14th century Tallinn. The bedroom has a heat storage hypocaust in the basement. You light one fire, heat the granite stones, and that room stays comfortable for 3 days. But you also have tapestries on the walls, preventing body heat from radiating into cold stone, heavy curtains over windows blocking drafts, wool stuffed into cracks around door frames. And you have a strategy. During the day, when active, you tolerate cooler temperatures. You wear layers. You move to sunny rooms. You do physical work that generates body heat. At night, you retreat to the heated bedroom. You close the curtains. You pile on wool blankets. And you sleep in comfort. Because stones below your floor still radiate heat from a fire that went out yesterday. This is not primitive. This is sophisticated. Compare it to a modern American home. We heat every room to the same temperature, whether occupied or not. We use forced air systems that dry out the air and create drafts. We rely on constant energy input, burning gas or electricity 24 hours a day. And the moment that energy supply is interrupted, we are helpless. No heat storage, no thermal mass, no backup strategy. Medieval homes had all three. They stored heat in granite. They used mass in stone walls. And they had a backup, centralize in one heated space if fuel runs low. Now, I am not saying we should abandon modern heating. Central heating is comfortable. It is convenient. For most of human history, cold killed people. Modern heating saves lives. But medieval heating had one massive advantage: resilience. If you could not get fuel for a week, a medieval home with a heat storage hypocaust still had residual warmth. The stone walls still held some heat. The textile insulation still prevented some loss. A modern home loses heat in hours. This matters more than you think. Climate change is making weather more extreme. Winter storms knock out power more frequently. Energy prices are rising. At some point, constant, cheap, reliable energy might not be available. And when that happens, thermal mass, passive heating, and smart insulation are not medieval relics. They are survival tools. The monks at Rievaulx survived Yorkshire winters with one fire. The townspeople of Tallinn survived Baltic cold with one fire every few days. Rochester Castle stayed above freezing with stone walls and tapestries. They did this without electricity, without natural gas, without any technology we consider essential. They did it with mass, with storage, with insulation, and with strategy. We have better materials now. We understand thermodynamics. We can engineer systems medieval builders could only dream of. But we have forgotten the fundamental principles. Heat mass, not air. Store energy, do not just consume it. Integrate systems instead of isolating them. Medieval heating worked because medieval engineers had no choice. Energy was expensive, fuel was limited, survival required efficiency. We have choices. We have cheap energy. We have forgotten efficiency. But cheap energy is ending, and when it does, we are going to rediscover everything medieval engineers knew 800 years ago. In 1422, a monk lit a fire beneath granite stones. 3.5 hours of flame, 5 days of warmth. 400 years later, in 1822, engineers tested that same system. It still worked perfectly. 0.7 cubic meters of wood, $15 of fuel, 3 days of heat for an 850 square meter hall. In 2025, we pay $300 per month for heat that dies the moment we stop paying. Who was more advanced? The answer is not what you think. Medieval engineers were not smarter than us. They just could not afford to be wasteful. Energy was precious. So they built systems that stored it, conserved it, and made every piece of wood count for days instead of hours. We built systems that require constant input because energy was cheap. But energy is not cheap anymore, and those medieval principles, thermal mass, centralized efficiency, passive insulation, they are not historical curiosities. They are the future we are going to need. Because the best survival technology is not some gadget from Amazon. It is knowledge that survived 8 centuries of testing. Knowledge that still works. Knowledge that we forgot because we did not have to remember it. Until now. If you want to see how medieval builders preserved food for 2 years without refrigeration, using methods that still work today, hit that subscribe button. Next video drops in 3 days. This channel is about one thing: uncovering the techniques medieval people used to survive that we have forgotten. Techniques that might save your life when modern systems fail. Because they will fail. They always do. But knowledge? Knowledge lasts forever. Thanks for watching.